computer. Okay, so I should now be recording. Yeah, good.
You're famous.
Right? Okay, well, I'll just get started then, because it's 9:01. And I have no idea how long it's gonna take. I hope I can fit it in 2 hours. Otherwise, so I'm gonna rush through some things. And we'll see how this goes. So I kind of have my own slide deck, but it's complementary to this other set of slides made by Olivier Jimenez, who's a faculty member at somewhere in Canada. I want to say it's not University of Montreal. It's somewhere in Quebec. Maybe it's University of Concordia, something like that. But it's like, why reinvent the wheel? So is less work on me. I'm just gonna use a lot of his material and then supplement it with things I wanted to make sure I covered in a certain order. Okay, so I'm going to start this. And yeah, so today I'm basically going to be talking about how to use Git and GitHub through RStudio. So most of the time, especially if you're using a different language like Python, or you're not using Python or R, you could still use Git and GitHub on your command line. So if you're using terminal or like a bash command line shell system, you just have to like do all the command line coding yourself, which is not as easy to understand what's happening. But with recent updates to RStudio as of, I don't know how long ago, years ago, it's a lot easier to do this than like needing to code everything yourself, but it'll still print out some of the actual commands, so you can at least see kind of what it's doing in the background. But this makes it really easy to, essentially how I say here at the bottom, effectively back up, share, and track changes to your code and data. So I'm going to try to convince you why this is a good idea to use Git and GitHub as a part of your normal workflow for you're doing your analyses. And then when I get to the end, provide some hands-on examples of like doing this with like a test set of code, and then talk about creating like an organization, which is the term GitHub uses for the lab as like a common repository for data or lab protocols, guidelines, all that kind of stuff. Okay. This will work. Okay, so yeah, why use Git and GitHub anyway? And again, these are two different things that kind of communicate with one another. So the first is backup of storage for any files to the cloud. So GitHub is a cloud service. It can store data, R scripts, PowerPoints. If it's a file, you can store it. Folders of files. So in addition to like Google Drive or your external hard drive, this serves as like another nice way to store things as a backup in case you lose data and your computer crashes, or like your external hard drive like busts or like goes missing. This isn't just another place you can keep all those things.
Do you know of any data file that it doesn't support?
No. The issue that I've run into is that if you try to add a data file that's larger than 100 megabytes, it will give up on you and say that's not possible. And then you have a little bit of a problem where like you can't communicate with it anymore until you resolve the issue. And there's a workaround that I've figured out how to do it, undo it basically, so you can get back to where you were. But until somebody runs into that issue, I'm not gonna write the code out for that just because it's not gonna make sense to you now anyway. But yeah, the symbols next to each bullet is gonna represent whether this is mainly like a feature of Git or GitHub. So the little, what's called an octocat symbol there is for GitHub. And then this little like branching node symbol is for just Git. So tracking changes to files, which is called version control. So if you ever see somebody, especially for like job announcements or PhD or postdoc announcements where they want somebody with version control experience, there's other options besides GitHub, like GitLab, and I think there's some other stuff too. But GitHub is the most popular, and then this is like a way to create a reproducible workflow that you can like, how you have like track changes for like a Word document or Google Doc. You can do the same thing with your code. So it makes it nice and easy to kind of see what you've done, especially if you mess something up. You don't need to like comment out like a figure or code that you know works and then worry about it being deleted or make a million files the same thing with different names like version 1, version 2, version 3, etc. You just overwrite it essentially into a new version, and you can always return to the previous version if it breaks. Which is the second point, ability to roll back to a previous version of the file if you need to for some reason. There's plenty of times where I'll write code or like a function, and then I don't need it anymore, so I'll delete it. But then months later, I'm like, I could use this for a different project, and I start searching through my old versions of code. So it's nice to at least have if future you potentially need something that you deleted previously. I'm not sure how useful this is, at least at the moment, but easier to collaborate with coding on a project. So there might be multiple people that share a common repository, and each person can simultaneously be working on this project on the coded data set. And then if one person makes an update, the other people can basically take that update, pull that update from the cloud, and then start building off of that. At the very least, you can always just copy and paste the code from the online repository to your RStudio script. And this also makes it easier to create reproducible research and workflows. So that's a big push now, is to do like reproducible research. If somebody else can't reproduce what you've done, then it's kind of implied that you're doing something sketchy. So if you have to like share your data and share your code when you publish, which is what a lot of people are pushing for, and another person can't do it, then there's a chance that they may say that you messed up, and you're gonna have to potentially either retract or revise your submission.
Yeah, I think a lot
Right,
of
the
the
core
boards
Gentham.
are requesting the
Yeah.
codes now. Like we have, I mean, I only had one time that was like, you have to have it, but it's depending on.
Yeah, so there's like Figshare, Dryad. I use Zenodo, and that interfaces directly with GitHub. So it requires very little effort to actually like publish your code and your data, and then people can cite that later. So you can get citations just from the work you already did for the paper you're publishing. So it's pretty easy to do.
Does
And-
Zenodo generate a DOI?
Yes,
Or
yep. So that's nice.
Yeah.
And then the last bullet is the transfer of knowledge, skills, tips, tricks among everybody here, but then especially for people that will be joining the lab later once you're leaving. So a big issue with labs is that you have people that spend a bunch of time there, 5 or 6 years if you're doing a PhD, gain all these skills, and then they leave and those skills disappear. And ideally, you're not going to expect like everyone to maintain that set of skills and like completely build up this huge skill base necessarily, but at least the ones that are most important hopefully would be transferred across students that leave or that join. So hopefully this would provide like a common resource for especially new people to return to, and if they're doing stabilized slope analysis or animal movements or genomic stuff or whatever it is, they at least have something to refer to, so they're not starting completely from scratch. So as long as everything's commented out, you have metadata, you have all these other things that can basically like describe what you've done, it makes that learning curve a lot quicker. Okay. So I think I sent these out in the previous email last week, but some of the R packages I'm going to be using for GitHub related things are going to be the use this package, Git creds, and dev tools. And then for just like examples of like coding scripts for our hands-on examples, I have these bottom 4 packages installed. So if you don't have those installed already and you didn't install them earlier, then please do that now. And that way, if there's an issue, we can deal with it, and we don't have to mess with it later on once we start these examples. So if you have an issue, just let me know, but these are the packages we're gonna want to install. Does anybody need me to write these down before I move forward? Okay, cool. So I was pretty vague about what I wanted people to do before we started, but at the very least, everyone should have Git installed. And if you have a Mac, it should probably be installed by default. like automatically. But if you have a PC, you would have needed to actually like, download and install Git on your computer. So that's kind of like the first requirements and could potentially result in problems if not configured properly. So hopefully you just followed the instructions and didn't like receive an error or warning as you were doing that. Was everybody able to install Git without any issues?
What, mine says git bash.
Yeah, that's like a PC thing. Yep. Okay. So the next thing you're going to do if you don't already have one is create a GitHub profile. So if you just go to github.com, we can just do that now. So I'll log out to show what that would look like. But yeah, this is kind of the home page. So you could either add your email here to this window or go up to sign up and enter your information. So like email, name. You also need to choose a username. And I would highly recommend choosing something that's professional sounding because this is something you're going to potentially refer people to look at your code. And it's going to have your name on it. It's like I have my personal website hosted on GitHub. So everything related to my website, the R packages I've made, all start with my username. So to actually like interact and collaborate with people, you want them to have something professional sounding. Yeah.
Do you think it's better to sign up with like a personal email instead of?
I have a personal email because yeah, if you have a .edu email and then you graduate and then you don't have access to email anymore, you're out of luck. So yeah, once everybody has an account created, then we can move forward. So I'll just sign back in
This
really
animation's so fancy.
Huh?
The animation,
Oh yeah.
like this galaxy.
Yeah, when you get in, right?
Yeah, holy smokes.
So if you were to like kind of just like log in once everything's set up, you probably have nothing here just because I'm whatever following people or there's just recommended activity based on things I've looked at or made. So that's a good thing if you just have this, something similar to this. Okay, so that's what my like profile looks like. So in your profile, it'll have like, this is the overview. So you could have like your name with your username, general info about you, links for like your website or Twitter, or like anything. Then this like colored kind of like table calendar is like the number of contributions basically you've made over time. So it kind of just highlights what you've done relative to other days. And you can even have like pinned repositories up at the top, I think up to like 6 maybe or something. And then there's like other different pages related to different things you can do, which I will gloss over for the moment. Actually, yeah, I think that's where I want to end with the slides for the moment. And I will go to these slides. Okay, does everybody have their profile set up? Okay. So now I'm going to jump over to Olivier's slides. And some of the stuff's going to overlap a little bit. So he has the beginning kind of referencing or crediting people that he used to make his work, his resources here. But I think this like PhD comic is pretty on point here. Because I've definitely, especially for like all my Word docs for drafts of my dissertation or a manuscript or anything like that, it's just like you have all these different versions with other versions with people's edits, and especially if you try to use the name final on anything, is don't ever do that because it won't be the final one. So this is something we're trying to basically get around. This is version control. You're creating a new name for each version of this draft, and the names here aren't particularly informative, but we want to kind of avoid having to duplicate, having like 20 files of the same thing, whereas you can only keep one and then store the other 19 on GitHub, essentially. So that's kind of what we're going to shoot for here. So version control, it's basically managing changes to documents, programs, anything. And I want to make the distinction here between Git and GitHub. Git is version control software, and this could be done completely on your computer. You don't need the internet or GitHub to do this. So one kind of analogy here is if Dropbox and track changes from Microsoft Word had a baby, it would be Git. And I think Google Docs has something basically where it's like track changing that live document. So it's basically, you have a cloud version of this thing that also has track changes to it, versioning. And GitHub basically interfaces with Git, and it basically stores your repository, so your folders, files, all that stuff online. So this makes it easier to work with other people, but then also provides a backup of your data and files. So at the bottom, you don't need GitHub to use Git, just like the analogy, you don't need RStudio to run R. You could run just normal R by itself. I already talked about this. I'm going to skip that slide. And I mentioned this at the beginning, but before you could only use Git through the terminal or like the bash shell window. But now you can do it with RStudio, so it makes things a lot easier. So the first thing we're going to do is try to configure our setup. And just to show that you probably don't have anything set up, obviously, is we're going to use this function from the use this package. So you could either like load in the use this library, and then you don't need to like specify where it's coming from, or you could just type it in as is, but you're going to do the use this. The 2 colons back to back is basically saying that it's coming from the use this package. And then you want the get underscore sitrep function with open parentheses, nothing in them.
I'm gonna go save my glass. I have my glass.
Okay.
Just being honest. Forgot.
And I'm going to do this on my computer just to show you. Open a new window. It's whole screen. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So in the console, I'm going to do use this get sitrep. And yeah, I made it so you need typically what's called a personal access token. And mine just like expired as of like yesterday. So this way I can show you what it like potentially would look like a little bit, and like how to basically create a new token. So mine has a bunch of other info associated with it, I think, potentially. But it basically is saying there's these 2 red X's saying token is invalid and can't retrieve registered email. But it does have my like name and email associated with it, which yours won't at the moment. And we're going to deal with that. But this is something like what you should have on your computer.
Would you usually put this in console, or would you have it in a script?
Console.
Okay.
Yeah, because I mean, a lot of this stuff you're just going to do once,
Right.
and then
right.
you're done.
Yeah.
So there's other things that you might want to save as a script just as a reference, or you could just go to the one like website, like Happy Git with Git and GitHub with R or something like that.
Right.
That's like, yeah, like the Bible of like trying to interact with GitHub from RStudio. That's like my go-to resource. Okay, so the next thing to do based on these slides is we're going to use the use git config function from the use this package. And there's going to be 2 arguments you need to enter: the username, which is going to be the username you just created, and then the user email, which is the email associated with your account. So I'm going to copy this just to show. Okay, I'll check back on you in a second. But yeah, so hopefully that worked for everybody else. And that's basically connecting your accounts from GitHub with your RStudio. IDE. But the next thing we need to be able to like actually communicate with GitHub is to create what's called a personal access token, abbreviated as like just PAT. And the way to do this is to use the use this package for the create GitHub token function. And I'll do this also because mine has expired. And dun, 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 dun. So if you do that, nothing inside the parentheses, it should bring you to this page online. And this note is kind of just like the name of what that token should be. I think I already have one with this name, but I'll just see what it does. You can also choose the expiration. So by default, it's going to be 30 days. You could potentially set it for like no expiration, which is easier than having to like create a new token every time, especially if you don't have anything that's like highly sensitive that you need to like recreate one every month or so. So it's probably easiest just to set it to no expiration. And I would just leave all the default settings for checkboxes. So one is just for doing things with your repository, which is abbreviated as a repo. Workflows, just general stuff with something called GitHub Actions. If you want to create gists, those are just like example thing like code scripts without like creating a whole repository for them. And then just other stuff related to you, the user. That's typically all I use or have checked for the token. And then you just click generate token. And yeah, I already have this name. I'll just rename this to PAT and see if that works. You can name yours what, I mean, you shouldn't have a token yet. So if you just leave it as the default, it should be fine. You can make it, yeah, literally anything, especially if it has no expiration, then it doesn't matter. But what you need to do is make sure you copy it. So I'll have like this copy button here, and it should be on your clipboard. And once you leave this page, you're never going to see this token again. So if you somehow like lose your connection with GitHub, you're just going to have to create a new token like we just did. So like you see, I have like 4 different tokens here. Yeah, we could turn the lights off. So I just need other side of the wall. Yeah, there you go. I just need to create new tokens every time. But if you copy this and then you go back to RStudio, the next thing we need to do is it has this code here right after you ran the create GitHub token function. So now we need from the git creds package that I said to install, we want to use the git creds set function. And again, you're just going to leave this empty inside the parentheses. And if you do that, this is where you're going to enter your personal access token. So for me, because I already had something, it's giving me different options, but for you, it should just say set password or token. So for me, I'm going to replace my credentials and enter new password token. So you just paste it in there and then hit enter. And then now it's added them and stored them on your computer. So like, you don't need to like look them up again. It's just already saved in like a folder in RStudio. So you don't need to like type it in all the time. And if you just want to make sure that things were done properly, let me go to my slides. Set, yeah. So if you run the use this git sitrep function again, it should basically tell you that everything looks fine. So now I don't have any of those angry X's. It recognizes that I have a token. It says the scope, so like what I'm allowed to do based on that token. my email, username, all that kind of stuff. And that would mean that you're good to go, basically. So hopefully, assuming every other step has worked for you up to this point, you have something that resembles this and there's no like errors or red X's or anything saying that like it's messed up.
Vaccinated, like vaccinated?
I forget what that technically means, but it's it's something
Look it up.
GitHub related. Yeah, I forget what that actually means.
So we got, so.
Vaccinate your global PD similar.
The what?
My ear says that you're vaccinated, it's true.
Yeah.
That's false.
Yeah, I don't remember what it.
It's something about leaking credentials to GitHub. I don't know. Not
We-
that that means much to me.
Were you guys able to get yours working? Okay, cool.
Fun fact, don't store your PAT as an R object.
The recommended advice, at least previously, used to be storing it in your R environment. So like the slides I'm going through,
Yeah.
it says to store it as like an option in your R environment, and that's not recommended anymore. So don't do that. And I used to do that when that was still the advice, and then it kept giving me issues and it kept failing, and I couldn't figure out why. So it'll probably just cause like problems, and then it won't work anymore. So just never go into that unless you absolutely have to for different reasons, but don't store an access token in there.
Yeah.
That's gonna be for later. Let's see, do I? Yes, okay. Everything going well over there?
Yeah, I should have listened to my thing about new glasses.
Okay. All right, good. So now everyone's basically configured and connected their GitHub account with RStudio. Okay, and one thing that used to be a thing. So there's what are called branches, and I'll discuss these in a little bit. But the default name for a branch would typically be master. And then especially like following 2020, there's all these like DEI pushes and other things like remove names and terms that either reflect slavery or other things of that nature. So they started changing things related to GitHub. So now the default repository is main if you create one online, but for some reason, if you create one from RStudio first and then move it as an online repository, it defaults to master. So the way to make it default to main is to use this function. So the git default branch configure, but apparently it only works for each like new repo you create, because I tried creating a separate new one and assumed that I only had to run this once, and then it created a branch name called master. So this is something you would need to potentially use each time. And again, this is only if you create a repository on your computer first. And when we get to the hands-on examples, I'm actually going to recommend creating it on GitHub online first, as just an easier way to do it. But if you forget and you create it on your computer first through RStudio, it's not the end of the world. But this is how you would change the name of the branch from master to main. So you could run this right now if you want. Otherwise, we could just do that
You don't have to
later.
specify anything.
No.
Okay.
Yeah, you just leave it
Just does
open.
it.
Yep.
Cool.
Okay, I think that might be my last slide for them. No, okay. So yeah, vocabulary. So there's a whole laundry list of different terms that you might see or hear. And I don't expect you to remember all these, but I'm just going to try to explain them just so you at least have a general sense as I continue to kind of talk about this stuff. And there's 3 different slides related to vocab, and I try to break them up by like, how they group together. So I have this diagram here showing how a repository is related to what are called local and remote kind of locations for storage of the repository, and then branches, which I just talked about, and cloning. So a repository is essentially just a folder that contains all your tracked files for version control. You also hear referred to as a repo for short. I'll almost always refer to it as a repo. And you see in the diagram how we have the cloud here. This is GitHub, which is referred to as a remote because it's a remote location. It's not local, local meaning like where you are, which is your computer. So local is a local version of that repository, and the remote is the remote storage of that repository. And then you can have what are called branches. So I had mentioned before, changing the branch name for default from master to main. A lot of times for projects for people that do software engineering or collaborative coding, you typically have one main branch, and that's where all of your code works. You know that works, and it's for like operations of like doing things. And then a lot of times if you're doing something on your own, maybe you might have one other branch called like dev or something similar, and that's your development branch. So that's where you test things out, where you might break code and like cause problems, but it's not going to affect like your main code, which would be maybe on a website or it's an R package from breaking, and then people try to install it and they're like, this doesn't work anymore. So you want to make sure it works on the dev branch before you merge it with the main branch. If you're working with multiple people, maybe each person has their own development branch. And then when they're ready to add it to the main branch, because they know it works, then they'll merge it in. But you'll hear often things about like branches. But if you're only working on a single project by yourself, for most cases, you're just going to use a single branch, and that's going to be called main. And one thing you need to do essentially when you first create a new repo, especially if you create it online on GitHub first, is called cloning. So you need to basically like copy a URL of your repo online and then have it pasted into a function or like a window in RStudio. So that way it connects that online repo with your local kind of RStudio setup. So that's what a clone would be. So does this roughly make sense to everybody for the moment? Okay, so building off of that, now we're getting into stages of like what you do with this configuration. So for this, there's different types of things that are basically part of a standard workflow, which are called staging, committing, pulling, pushing. And some of these have both nouns and verbs. So what this diagram is showing is each of these different kind of phases of this workflow, of this process. So again, we have this remote repository in the cloud. This is GitHub. And then there's examples for here, 2 different people collaborating on a project. So developer A, developer B. And the first term is going to be called stage. So the noun version is this staging area that holds all these files you've added and are ready to basically commit, which I'll describe in a second or define in a second. And to stage or staging is to mark these files to be included for this next commit you're going to make. Committing or a commit is a snapshot of the changes you made. So you want to break this into like chunks of like maybe you work on some part of your code one day. At the end of the day, you commit it because that's like one thing or a few things you worked on, and it breaks it up instead of like waiting a full week and then having like 8 to 10 changes where something might have broken or gone wrong in between. So you want to make it into manageable chunks here. Same with like when you create R script, you don't have a single R script for everything you do. You have several different R scripts for different pieces of your work. And committing is the act of creating this snapshot of your files. So this is like the version control part where you're taking a snapshot of one version of your files or data before you send it online, which is called pushing. But the next term is pull. So to pull or pulling is basically pulling, retrieving the commits from the remote repository, from GitHub. So especially if you're working with multiple people, somebody might have pushed a change online, and if you don't pull it, you're going to have an issue when you try to commit these and push them online, because there's going to be a clash in your code potentially. And if you're working by yourself, it's still a good habit, I think, to pull things, because I'll work on 2 different computers now. So like if I work on my desktop in the office, and then I work from home one day and I'm working on my laptop and I'm trying to commit a change, I could like run into issues if I have some code on my desktop and some code on my laptop, but not on both of them at the same time. And then pushing is sending your commits from your computer, from the local repository to the remote. And this diagram is showing that process, that workflow. So developer A, everything that's a green, yellow or gold and red is the processes of staging. So green means you're working on something, but nothing's been done yet. You haven't staged it yet. Gold means it's been staged. And then once it becomes red, this is when you committed those staged changes. So again, this is all done locally. None of this has even been pushed to GitHub yet. But then you see this central arrow coming from the local repository once it's been committed, where it says push. So that's moving those changes from your computer to GitHub, to the cloud. We also have the clone arrow where you're pulling changes from GitHub or the remotes to your local, which I just discussed the previous slide. Fetch is basically something similar. And then here we have pull in red. We are pulling whatever is on the cloud to your local version, in case there's been any updates in the meantime. So this is essentially the workflow you would use on a regular basis for interacting with GitHub. And then the last set of like extra vocabulary is going to include some other terms that you may run into, but won't be as common probably. So there's what's called a fork or forking. So the noun means to make a copy of somebody else's repo. So like, let's say somebody's working on a project at a different university and you want to use or repurpose some of their code. You can potentially copy a single script, but if you want to like take all the different files they have and then start messing with it on your own, you could just copy the whole repo, and that's called forking the repo. And there's a button where you literally just say fork, and then you can like clone it to your computer. And then there's the verb forking, so like forking somebody's repo to make it your own. So this diagram is showing the octocat here, so meaning GitHub. So this is online, the remote. Them meaning the other person has this repo labeled source. And you're basically forking that repo to make a copy on GitHub first for yourself. And then you can pull that repo or clone the repo to your local computer and then push changes to your version. Additionally, there's options where, like, let's say they've made changes to their copy online and you want to make updates, so you've incorporated their changes as well to get the latest version. You could pull those upstream basically updates to your local repo, essentially your local version. And if you wanted to suggest they make changes based on what you've been working on, you could do what's called a pull request, which would be kind of working from the GitHub side and moving stuff to them. So I'll come back to pull requests in a second, but merging after fork is just updating the files by incorporating changes after these new commits. So you're merging new changes to the original version of a file. There's also going to be different buttons you might see in RStudio called diff and history. Diff is viewing the differences between each of these different versions. So the current version that you have versus the previous one that you've already committed in the past. And this is really nice to just see what changes and updates you've made, especially when you commit. Because let's say you've been working all day on your code and you made some changes, but then you've maybe gone back to them and kept the original version and you don't remember what you changed anymore. So when you commit, you typically add a message like what that commit did, like what you did in that snapshot. And a lot of times I don't remember. So I have to look at the diff kind of copy and it'll like highlight in red what stayed the same and in green what's changed or been added. And then history is a different kind of window that will pop up, and it just shows kind of the branches of your repo if you have any, but also kind of the sequence of commits that you've made over time, especially if you've had a different branch merged in, you can kind of see what has happened and how your repo has evolved. In case you need to go back to a previous version, and you can copy like the ID for that given commit. And last, something you'll probably never really worry about or have to do is a pull request, which, like I mentioned, is if you fork somebody's repo and then you make updates and want them to consider those updates, then you would like send them your copy and they can look at it and decide if they want to incorporate them or not. But I doubt people really do that, so don't worry really about that at all right now. And okay, so the standard GitHub workflow is, in general, when you first open RStudio with GitHub, the first thing you generally would want to do is pull. So before you write any code, before you edit any code, you want to pull the second you open your R script for that repo. Because if you're working with somebody else or a different computer that you were doing work on, like your desktop at school, and then you want to use your laptop at home, if you pull after you've already made changes, you might get a conflict, and then you need to deal with that, and that takes time and it's a pain. So it's always good to just pull and merge in those changes before you do anything else. Next would be making the commit. So once you're done coding, you take that snapshot of your changes and you write an informative brief message about what those changes were. And then if you're collaborating with people, you might want to pull again, just in case somebody pushed a change online while you were coding and making modifications. So you shouldn't have to worry about this, but if you are coding with other people in the same repo, this might be something you want to make sure you pull again before you, or after you make a commit. And then last is pushing. So sending these commits that you've made online to GitHub.
If you're working with someone else, like let's say you're, whatever, editing a script,
Mhm.
and then you commit and you pull and someone else edited it, how does it, like, what does that practically look like in terms of like?
So if they're editing on their local computer, then GitHub is agnostic to that. It doesn't know anything's happened. So when they try to commit, if you made a change on one piece of code and they've also edited that code, and you push it first, when they push, if they don't pull, then they're going to get an error saying there's a conflict and they need to resolve it.
What if they pull and they see your script and you've like worked on the same piece of code? I don't know,
That's where communication.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, I'm
Yeah.
just wondering if this is like meant like you're working on different parts of the same script.
Yeah, it's like if you like say I'm going to do this part and they work on another part, then you shouldn't have to worry about it. But
Gotcha.
yeah,
Okay.
it's
yeah.
just something like you might run into the issue and it's like, okay, now we need like email or like have a call and see like why this is an issue.
Gotcha. Okay.
Um,
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm gonna exit out of my slides really quick and go back to Olivier's. And another really important topic I've kind of skipped up into this point is RStudio projects. And you may never have heard of RStudio projects before. I never used RStudio projects until I actually started using GitHub. But it's basically a way to keep all of your materials together into a self-contained like file folder area. So you already should have like a folder, and that's like your working directory where you keep all of your stuff. And then you need to use like set working directory every time. And the potential issue with that is it's not portable, meaning that if you were to send that code to somebody else, they would need to adjust the set working directory code. And maybe there's like some folders in there that aren't like reflective of stuff they have. So it's just easier to not deal with that and just keep these self-contained RStudio projects. And when you create an RStudio project, you can actually link it to your GitHub repo, which makes things a million times easier. So I would recommend that for every separate like working directory you have, where you have like a different project, you change it and basically create an RStudio project where you link it to your GitHub repo. There's more info online kind of about that and like the benefits of doing that. But it's really simple to do, and I'll show you how to do that during our hands-on example. while you're creating a new RStudio project, there's even like a checkbox now for newer versions of RStudio where you can just say create GitHub repository. So it like does some of the stuff in the background automatically for you, and it's just one less step you need to do. Although I would say that shouldn't be something you potentially come across that often, just because that's if you create the GitHub repository on your computer before on GitHub. And I'm going to recommend doing it on GitHub first and then cloning it to your local computer. But I'll show you both versions just to get a sense of what's happening. I'm going to skip this and we'll just talk about this because this is going to be in RStudio, this panel. Terms we already talked about, workflow, sharing, we're going to skip for now. Okay, so I'm going to discuss this briefly. So on GitHub, there's for just about every repository and even like your GitHub profile, something you can add that's called a README. And a lot of times if you download other like data even online, you might have like a TXT file, text file that says README. And you should always read that first because that describes what's there, maybe any metadata about how to use it, configure it. So without that, you're blind. And your README, if you were to write one for your own repo, should just provide a brief description about what you're doing with your project. There's some people where, especially if it's like an R package, it has like a whole set of examples and it could be like super long. But for stuff you're probably working on, for the most part, it doesn't need to be long at all, just like a paragraph at most, maybe. For a lot of my stuff, I kind of just leave it blank. But ideally, you'll have like a couple sentences just describing what you're doing. Licenses are something that they exist. I doubt you'll really do anything with them unless you're creating like software. But it basically is saying like what people can do with your code potentially. So like an MIT license is like one of the most flexible, where it's like completely open. Anybody could use that for any purpose, commercial or otherwise. There's different types of licenses. But if there's no license associated with the repo, technically they can't do anything with your repo, like your code or stuff. But in general, apart from like the R packages I've worked on, I don't even generate a license. So if you publish your data like on Zenodo or Dryad or something, you probably need to associate with the license to tell people how they can use your code, whether they need to cite it, whatever they can do with it. But for just standard coding, you could just skip this altogether. We'll skip this stuff. I don't want to spend long on this, but I do want to talk about GitHub issues, especially like, let's say you're using an R package and the function you're using for that version of the package isn't working, or you've run into a problem and you don't know how to fix it. And maybe normally you would just Google it and look on like Stack Overflow or Stack Exchange or something. One of the first places I go is assuming they have a GitHub repo for their package, which more often than not, they do. But if they do have a GitHub repo, they also have a tab for that repo called issues. And I'm going to, I guess I could leave that full screen. Go to a package called foie gras, which is for basically state space modeling of animal tracks. So this is all the files and folders in their repo. One thing you also see is like a brief description in the about at the top right here. And then underneath that, if they have a website for their package, it'll be here. So this is the website for that foie gras package. And then if you wanted to fork it, you would click this button that says fork. If you go down, this is the README. So he has a hex sticker associated with the package. Each of these different badges that just give descriptions about it. The DOI for the Zenodo repository here, where the package code is stored. Brief description about it, how to install it, all these good things, and then an example of how to use it. But what I want to talk about is the issues tab. So we're on code. You go to issues. You see the first thing that pops up is the open issues. So these are all the things that are still problems that haven't been fixed yet. And if your issue overlaps one of these, it's probably not a good sign because it hasn't been fixed yet. But what you want to do is go to the closed issues and then start looking down and seeing what people say. So maybe you're concerned about the error ellipses for these tracks. So I guess this is the code author's own issue he created, which sometimes they will do to like keep track of what things they need to make updates on, and just showing how you can plot the ellipses associated with these fitted tracks on the map. But let's see somebody else's. This is somebody that's trying to fit the behavioral state model to it, and they will provide like a reproducible example, and then he'll kind of talk with them on this thread, and then eventually at the bottom it gets closed because they fixed it. So if you have an issue that's specifically related to a single package, I would start here, because if it's been a problem for other people, then hopefully they've looked into it. If not, then maybe move on to like Stack Overflow, Stack Exchange for something more general. But that's all I really want to talk about, the issues. And basically talked about that already. Gonna skip this. And what I've mentioned before in the emails is using this link, Happy Git and GitHub, for the user. If you have any questions or you forget stuff from this presentation and you don't want to rewatch 2 hours of me talking, this is a nice resource for just like accessing things, and it's really separated out and organized very well. And a lot of the materials I basically like put together for getting this ready came from this. So I would highly recommend referring to this website if you have any problems. And if you can't find it here, then potentially look around elsewhere, but this should be your first stop. And yeah, that's, I think, it for these slides. Let me see if there's anything else for my stuff before moving on. No, okay, so now we're gonna do the hands-on stuff. So like I mentioned before, first we're gonna make a repo from GitHub to start off, and then clone it to the computer. And then after that, we're gonna do the opposite. So we're gonna create an R project first, and then push it to GitHub. So I want people to go back to RStudio. And there's multiple ways to create a project in R. Actually, yeah, we're not starting there first. We're going to start with the GitHub side first. So go back to, if you have your GitHub page open. So let me close that one. Okay, so if you're on your profile, you can either go to this plus symbol here and create new repository. You could also forget like the other default page, kind of when you log in. No, not that one. This, there's this button that says new here. So you could click on that to create a new repository. There's multiple different buttons and ways you can do the same thing. So it should come up by default. You're the owner. So in the URL, once you create it, it'll say github.com/your username/ the name of your repository. So for this example, since I'm going to be using the Palmer Penguins data set to do some stuff, maybe I'll call this Penguins1. And it'll tell you if it's available, meaning whether you've created a repo with the same name before, which most of your repo names should be always available, unless you create like 100 and then you start doing really similar things and then it's not. But it shouldn't be a problem. And I spelled penguins wrong. Okay. Description. So this would appear like in the about section, the top left. You could provide a brief description, maybe like testing GitHub with Palmer Penguins data. And then you have the option here to say whether it's public or private. So a lot of the stuff I'm currently working on has either like sensitive data that I don't want people to be able to download from my repo, or maybe it's like stuff you don't want other people to be able to like see or copy because you want to wait till it's published. Then you would change this to private. But the default is to leave it to public. There is the possibility to change it to private if you by accident left it as public when you created it. But that potentially means that in the meantime, if somebody found your repo, they still could have like seen it and accessed it. But unless you like show people your like username and like broadcast you're doing this, then no one's probably gonna even see that it exists. But yeah, if you don't want people accessing your data and you like push your data to your repo, probably best to leave this private. So for this example, I'm gonna put it as public. And the only other thing you should really need to click on after that is to add a README. So this is what's just going to create a README file for you, typically as a what's called a markdown document. So if you've ever heard of R Markdown, it's like the same thing, except it doesn't take R functions. It just has markdown text. And that's where you just like write out what you're doing. And a git ignore file will be made later once we load RStudio. And then we're not going to set a license, so we'll just leave that. But if you click create repository, now you have a repo. So this is your first repo. And what you would do to basically clone this to your local repo is you're going to click this green code button. And it provides you a few different options here for cloning. There's HTTPS, SSH, or GitHub command line interface. And I would recommend by default, just always do the HTTPS. Just keeping things simple. And what you would do is just copy this, basically the URL. And once we've done that, if we return to RStudio, now we're going to create a project. So you should have basically this project kind of drop down in your top right window of RStudio. And there's other places to access it, but this is the easiest, I feel like. So if you click on project where it says none, I have a bunch of ongoing projects, so I can choose these and they're just reordered based on when I used them last. But if you can go to new project, that'll create a new project. And why can't I see the window? New project. Why isn't this working? There it is. Okay. So since we already have a GitHub repo created, we're going to go down to version control. And then after that, since we're using Git, you're going to click on Git to clone it from a Git repository. And then you're going to paste in that URL. And by doing that, it's going to autocomplete the directory name by taking the end of that URL. And then the third line is what do you want to basically have it as the path. So your subdirectory. So set this to whatever you want. Some people have like a separate GitHub folder, and then all their GitHub repos are like folders of that folder. I tend to break mine down by different projects. So like a lot of my stuff, my past postdoc was in one folder as different folders. And then my stuff now is in like a current separate folder for different things. So you can set it up however you want. Doesn't probably matter too much for the moment, just because these are examples. But I'm just going to set it to my documents folder and click open. So it's going to be a folder within documents for me. And it's going to have this name Penguins1. So if you click create project, it's now going to refresh and create a new RStudio session. And you'll see at the very top of this window, it's kind of small up on the screen there, but it should say penguins1-main-RStudio now. And you'll see before when we click to create a new project, instead of project none, it says penguins1. So now you can see what project you have open. And then for the console, it'll show you the path for your working directory. So for me, it's documents/penguins1. And whenever you're creating a repo name, this is only one word, so I guess it's not a big deal. But especially for, I think, PCs, because they have some issues with this, is you can't have spaces in your file path. So if you're going to have multiple words for your repo, separate them typically by an underscore or maybe a dash, but don't just leave like a normal space. Otherwise, you might have just like problems with your computer trying to like read stuff and write things to that folder. And you'll see in the files panel here at the bottom, you have a README document, and it's a markdown document .md. The R project file. So if you were to click on that for Mac, like the Finder, it'll just open this automatically, and then a git ignore. And this is a list of files that won't be pushed to the GitHub repo. So if there's certain things you don't want to go online to the repo, you would like list them there. Okay, we're all good. So the one thing I want to direct you to, so now that we have, it says the Penguins 1 project on the top right now. If you look at this panel that has your environments, normally you'd have history, maybe connections, tutorial, but now we have this new Git tab that you've probably never seen before. And that's because it's connected to Git and GitHub. So if you click on that, now it has the git ignore file. So again, that's all the things that you want to not be pushed online to your GitHub repo. And then your R project file. So again, this is the file that's going to open up this project for you in RStudio. But then all these other buttons. So there's some arrows, diff, commits, like a cog, and I'll discuss those in a little bit, but just realize that this exists now. This is new. So what we're going to do is create some scripts and then practice like pushing them online and seeing how you would interact with it. And I've already written some example scripts that I'm going to start copying and pasting code from. So I'm going to do it again and forget a step. So I'll just talk about what is happening. But if you create a new script, so if you want to do a shortcut, it's Command or Control Shift N. And then I'm going to paste this in here and try to make this big. So we're just going to play around with this Palmer Penguins data sets and the packages I'm going to use for this, like I mentioned early on. You can either just load in the tidyverse package if you've installed that. Otherwise, I'm only going to be using dplyr and ggplot2 from that. Then the Palmer Penguins package to use that data. And then I'm also going to use the janitor package to clean up some of the names, the column names from the one data set, which is a nice quick way to make them usable, especially if, like, let's say you're loading in a CSV file where there's spaces or special characters, and you don't want to manually adjust them yourself, which could take a while if there's like 60 columns. Just use this clean names function from janitor, and it like changes everything to like underscores or periods and stuff. So it makes your life a million times easier than needing to like clean all the names yourself. But yeah, before you do that, you need to load in the data from the Palmer Penguins package, and you would do that using the data function and then writing out penguins, either in quotes or without quotes, it'll still work. So I'm gonna run that now. And if you've ever loaded in a data set from a package, you'll typically see that it shows like the promises it'll be there in your environments. And it's not till you try to like view it or do something with it that it'll show up fully. But we have two data sets. There's penguins and then penguins_raw. And we're going to use both of them. But for now, we're specifically going to focus on penguins raw. And yeah, the first thing I'm doing with the penguins raw data set is cleaning up those column names so they're easier to reference and call them. And I'm just calling this new object penguins_raw2. So now that I've done that, all these column names now are lowercase and they have underscores where the spaces were, but there's columns like study name, sample number, species, region. So these are all from Antarctica. The island they're from, what stage. There's only, I think, one stage in this data set. Individual ID, blah, 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 other things. So we'll look at some of these variables in a moment. And let me copy some more things. So maybe one thing we want to start with is just summarizing the data. Let's say on day one of like our analysis with our own data set, we just want to do some data summary and exploration. And maybe I want to look at the number of individuals per species per island. So there's 3 species in this data set and there's 3 islands. So this chunk of code from 19 to 22, I'm using the pipe from dplyr here. I don't know how familiar people are with that, but it's basically taking the Penguins raw2 data frame and then using that as the inputs, so the data object for all these successive cascading functions. So on line 20, I'm using mutate wrapped around across. So that means I'm going to potentially create a new column across multiple variables. So I'm basically just changing the species in the island variables or columns to factor, because by default they're characters. But to do this next step for counting or summarizing the number of individuals per species per island, I also want to show instances where there's nothing. And it needs to be in a character format or a factor format or class to show up. Otherwise, if it's character, it's not going to do it. So once these are now factors, line 21, I'm grouping by the species and the island, because that's how I want to summarize my data. And I'm adding this dot drop equals false. And that means that if there's a combination of species and island where there's missing data or there's no instances, it'll still show up. And the default is that it's equal to true and that it leaves these out. But I want to see all possible combinations. And then I'm using the count function here, which is going to give me the sample size, basically. So if I run that, now it's going to print out on my console as a tibble. So the first column is species, then island is second, and then n. So the number of individuals for that combination is in that third column. And because we changed these to factors and said we didn't want to drop combinations with 0 observations, you see some of these like Chinstrap, penguins at Biscoe Island, and Torgerson have 0 observations. And then for Gen2s, those are only found at Biscoe and not present at Dream or Torgerson. So those would have been left out had we not done those previous steps. But this is just a quick way to summarize and see what your data look like. Next, let's say instead of summarizing or aggregating by species and island, we want to look at the number of individuals per species per sex. So we could do something similar here with penguins underscore raw2 and pipe that into the group by with species and sex instead of species island. And let's say we're not worried about counting instances where there's only 0 observations. You can use the count function again, or you could use tally instead, and that'll do the same thing here. It'll just count the numbers. And there appear to be some instances where the sex wasn't determined. So for Adelie penguins, there's 6 individuals, so n equals 6, where they couldn't identify the sex. And there were 5 Gen2 penguins where they couldn't identify the sex. And then kind of the last data summary thing I'll show here is, let's say we want to look at the mean or average body mass and the standard deviation of body mass per species. So if we were to, again, use this penguins raw2 data group by species, because we're looking at species differences, and then using the summarize function, I'm going to have new columns called mean.mass and SD for standard deviation.mass. And then using the mean and SD functions, and you need to set na.rm, so na removed to true. Otherwise, you're going to potentially get some na values back. This now gives me a new data frame or tibble with the mean, mass, and the standard deviation per species. So that's cool. That's one version here. And let's say like that's all, we're working at the end of the day and it's 5 o'clock and we're just going to save this up and as is and push it to GitHub. So if you save that script in your folder, in your repo locally, and just say like data summary and save it. Okay, so now it pops up in my files window here as an R script. And now if I go up to the Git tab, we see that it pops up here as well. And you'll see kind of this panel of options and checkboxes and things. So the files here are unstaged at the moment. So they're existing in our local repo, but we haven't done anything with them besides create them. So the first thing you'd want to do is select all of these and stage them. So if there's only like 2 files, you can just check the boxes, but there's some instances where you might have like 30 new things that are loading in. So you could just click one, then hit Command or Control A to select all of them. And then if you check one box, it'll check all boxes. So if they're unselected, you get these yellow or gold like question mark boxes here for status. And that means it doesn't know what these are yet. If you check the box and you have this green A, that means you're just adding them. So they're brand new. They've never been in this repo before. So these are new added files. And I'll just show what I would do here. So there's gonna be nothing in your repo, but this blue down arrow is the pull button. So if you were to click this, you get this new window that pops up where it says here, git pull. If this goes away, yeah. And then it has like this line of code and it says already up to date, so good. There's no new changes that I needed to pull from my online repo, which makes sense because it's a brand new one. The next thing I would do is hit the commit button. So now we're gonna take that snapshot of our repo. And it's gonna open up a new window here for you. And this is your diff basically. So it's showing for each file that you have clicked on or highlighted here, what that addition or removal is. So anything green is an addition. So if I click data summary file, everything's brand new, so everything's green. And then in the top right, it says commit message. This is where you would type in what you did. So maybe the message might be like, add code to summarize, type, summarize penguin data. And then you would hit the commit button. So this is still on your local computer, but now it's taken a snapshot and it has this like basically bash code at the top. It shows your message and then what it did. So there's 3 files that were changed, 50 insertions, and then each of these different files you added to it. So you would close this.
A quick question.
Yes.
The previous comment is that if you're building up from.
So like if you haven't pushed it yet, and let's say you want to like change the message or change something with it, you could potentially click that. I typically never have to deal with. I might have used it like once. So that's not something I've really had to deal with much. And then the last thing you would do is hit the push button here. So the green up arrow, and that's now going to push all these committed files to the repo on GitHub. And it worked. So it says it pushed it to this URL. So this is our repo link. And everything's good. So there's no errors. And then I would close this and brings me back. So now if you look at your Git window, Git panel tab, it should be empty now because everything's been committed. There's nothing new here. And if we go back to our online repo, you should see those changes if you like refresh the window. So now it says these were pushed a minute ago. We have 2 commits. And then it shows all these files. And for each individual file, how long ago they were created or modified. So that's just the basic, like how you interact with this at first glance. But let's say we get back to working the next morning and we want to make some additions. So if we go back to our scripts and I'm going to add in some code to make some plots. So I'm just going to add a few lines beneath this. So visualizing some relationships in the data. So I'm going to make 2 plots using ggplot. One looking at stable isotope data, and then the second looking at a body mass comparison by species. So the first one, I'm just calling in the data frame or object penguins raw 2 again. The x-axis I'm going to set to be carbon, so delta underscore 13 C, and then because it cleaned the names, it's instead of like a per mil symbol, it's now 0_00.
Those O's or zeros?
O's. Yeah, so that's a lowercase o there. And then the same for delta 15N. And then I want to color these. I'm going to make a scatter plot. So I'm going to color the points by species. So within the aesthetics function here, I'm setting color equal to species. So just make sure that's within the aesthetics. If it's outside of it, it's not going to work properly. And then I'm creating a point and I'm just customizing some of the options. So setting size to 3, so it's a little bigger than default. And then I'm setting the transparency to 0.7 or the opacity. So that way it's slightly transparent. And then using scale color Viridis D, I'm using the Viridis color palette package for discrete variables because there's 3 species, it's not continuous. I'm removing the title by leaving these open quotes here, and then I'm changing the labels because by default, these labels are Gen 2 penguin, chinstrap penguin with the scientific name next to it. So like the legends can be super wide, it's gonna be like hard to like see our actual plot. So by using the labels argument, I'm making these smaller and easier to look at. Then I'm changing the axis titles using the labs function. So D13C for X, D15N for Y, using the black and white theme. And then so that both axes directions are on the same scale, I'm setting chord equal. And if you run that, you should get something else like this. And it might say there's some missing points, and that's because it might be missing one or both values of these stabilized topes. So that's fine. But there is this noticeable difference we can tell among species here. So Gen 2 penguins have the most depleted carbon and nitrogen, and then Adelie penguins are in the middle, and then chinstraps have the most enriched carbon and nitrogen here. So cool, we have some differences across species. And let's say now we want to look at their body size because maybe we think that's going to correlate somewhat with what they're feeding on based on these stabilized tope values. So you could potentially even just copy and paste and reuse some of these lines of code from the first plot. So the x-axis is now going to be species. And the y-axis I'm going to set to body mass, which in this case is labeled body mass G for grams. And then instead of color, I'm going to set it to fill because I want to fill in this violin plot I'm going to make. If you were to use color, it's going to change the outline color. If you use fill, it's going to change the fill of the area. So the default for the color outline is going to be black. I'm using G on violin to make this violin plot. Transparency is 0.7. And then I'm also going to add in the raw points as well, just to see the spread of those in addition to the violin plot. But there might be a lot of overlap, so I'm using G on jitter to jitter those points. And to not have to create a second scale color thing, by setting shape for geom jitter to 21, now it's going to be a point that has a fill along with a color outline. So I can just use one scale fill Viridis instead of scale fill and scale color to do both of these things. I'm removing the legend because it's not needed because it's going to be a separate plot per thing. And then I'm changing the labels again using scale X discrete so that they're actually short and succinct. Removing the X-axis title, changing the Y-axis title, and making the theme to black and white. And you should get something like this. Okay, And kind of regardless of whether you type it out exactly as I have, or maybe there's like an error if you're missing a comma or misplaced a parenthesis, doesn't really matter, I guess, too much here. So if we save this R script, let's say we're done now, and you have your Git tab open, now we see there's a new file there again, because we made a modification. So data summary, since it already exists, we're not adding it anymore, we can only modify it. So you'll see now a blue M, meaning that we are modifying an existing file. So maybe the next thing I would do is, again, pull from my remote repo. It says up to date, so that's good. I'm going to stage it, and now you'll see the M move from the right spot to the left spot. And then if I hit commit, now it'll have a part at the top of this kind of diff changes area where nothing's changed, but we've made some additions beneath it, so that's in green. If we were to, like, let's say, remove some of the summary code, it would show that as red, meaning we removed it. So for the commit message, maybe I'll say added plots, and then hit commit. It says one file changed, and then I'll push it. And now it's online. So if we were to return back to our online repo and refresh that page, now it says I made a commit 17 seconds ago. Now there's 3 total commits. And the only one I modified last was the data summary file. So that's essentially what it would look like for doing iterations of work on a single repo by starting on GitHub first. But next, I want to show what you would do if, let's say, you forget to start on GitHub first and you end up doing it from RStudio first, where in general, I recommend trying to do it from GitHub first because it's just easier, I think. But we'll show the other way. So I'm going to go back to RStudio, and I'm going to, so if you were to click on your like Penguins 1 tab at the top right, if you were to create a new project, you can also close a project. So if I close this project, now it's going to go back to project none. And if you have untitled files here or other saved files, those will pop up here too, potentially. But now what we're going to do is basically create a new project from RStudio first. So if we go to new project again, and this time we're just going to do new directory because we can't do version control. There's no GitHub repo. And should just be new project. And again, I'm just going to leave this in the documents directory. I'll label as Penguins 2. And then there's this option like it showed on those slides from Olivier, create a Git repository. So that might do some of the lifting for us here. And then you just hit create project. Okay, so now we have this new R project and it's labeled Penguins 2 this time. And by default, it adds in this git ignore and then the R project file. But there might be some other things we want to add in here. So maybe we want to add in the README. So from the use this package, we do add, no, it's use README, and probably just easiest to use the MD, so the markdown version instead of the RMD, the R markdown, and just leave it empty in this case, and it'll create a README for you. So you could potentially delete the badges section if you don't have any badges, and then say goal. I can edit that. Let's summarize more penguin data. And save it. And if you look in your console, it shows you like it set the project, wrote a new README file, and then opens this up to let you modify it. Let's say also we want to potentially configure GitHub. So from use this, I think it's, yeah, create. Let me go back to my slides. I feel like I might be missing something. Nope. Okay, maybe not. Let me go to Olivier's slides. Okay, use GitHub. So by clicking that box before, we should already have like the use Git part done. So we should only have to do use underscore GitHub. And in this, we might want to make some specific or changes to the default settings for the arguments. So let's say, so the default here is that it's a public repo. If you want it to be private, you would need to say private equals true. Otherwise, for now, the default is false. You can also potentially set if you want this to be a repo for an organization, but you would need to specify that here as well. If you don't want to make any of the changes from the default, just leave it empty and then just run it. Okay, I guess I do need to run the use Git function first. Okay, so it adds some of these things for us. It's okay to commit them. Yes, so for me, that's 3. I agree. All right, now I can run the use GitHub. So like I mentioned before, it sets the default branch to master. Come on.
Yeah.
But now you have a GitHub repo online, even though you made the local RStudio project first. And let me see if it's as easy as just running that code. But if we were to, no, run this to change our branch name by default, because for this automatically it says the default branch is master, but let's say we want to change it to main from the get default branch configure function. No, okay. Well, I'm not going to look into that further right now, but
No, huh,
yeah.
works for me.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, well, whatever. We'll just breeze past
Yeah.
that. But this is how you would set up a new GitHub repo if you make an R project first.
So when you ran the use GitHub, is it actually showing master as the branch?
Yep.
Or is it showing as main?
When it popped up in Safari, it showed as master.
Okay.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if it was like because you had a new account, the default is main.
No,
But
So it was already set to main.
right, it was- yeah.
So
we don't necessarily need to do more coding here since we've already walked through a workflow once already. So I might just skip the other stuff I potentially used. But okay, so we've done this, basically created repos in 2 different ways. But again, I recommend creating it on GitHub first, just because the options are a little bit easier to set from like a web page versus like setting arguments in R function. And you might not have all the same options. But another thing that's really common, at least for me, is to basically download R packages from the source on GitHub. Because let's say the R version you have isn't compatible with the current version on CRAN or something. Like this package does not work with R version 4.1 point whatever. So you can still install it, but you need to install it from source, meaning from GitHub, not from CRAN. So one package that I was able to find that has this issue is the visualize package. So this is a package that has color palettes based on different species of fish. And I think there's a lot of packages that used to only be on GitHub and now they put them on CRAN that I couldn't find like an example where there's only on GitHub. But this one had an issue for me when I was trying to download from CRAN. So we're going to do this from GitHub. So if you just Google R visualize GitHub, the first option that should hopefully pop up is this GitHub repo from N, I don't know if that's an abbreviation or last name, Sheets, yeah. So So we click on that. And this shows that they have a package website here with this URL, brief description, blah, blah, blah. They actually made a change 9 days ago, it looks like. There's their last commit. And if you scroll down their README, it has instructions for installation. So the first option here it shows is for the install.packages from CRAN. But if we want the development version, we can install from GitHub. So if you were to copy this chunk of code to RStudio, now if we go down, we don't even need to do library dev tools because we're specifying it from the package itself. And I'll take out the library. So there might be other weird options that you need to have set. And that'll depend from person to person. So like in this case, this is force equals true. And I forget what that stands for, but it's like forcing like other things to work or maybe overwrite an existing version. And if you don't include these and you just accept all the defaults, sometimes it just will either corrupt or it won't work. So just copy and paste whatever they have there because that's probably the version that works. So we're using the install_GitHub function. And bare minimum, all you need is within quotes, the username from that person, and then the / and then the name of the repo. And that should be it, basically, in almost every case. So if I run this, it'll now say it's downloading from GitHub, and it'll print out a bunch of things. If you see this where it wants you to update things, I generally always skip this, and it might just cause you problems if you try to install all these. So if you just enter nothing, it'll just skip any other updates. It says it's checking all the metadata and information for this package, installing it, blah, blah, blah. And then hopefully it doesn't produce an error or warning and it just says done. And that means it installed successfully. Did it work for you?
Yeah.
Cool.
I love the add fish shape option now.
Yeah, so back on the repo README, it has all these color palettes and how they could be used in different ways. So there's a million different packages for color palettes, but there's some cool ones on this one. But that's just showing an example of how you install a package directly from GitHub. Okay, I think I'm getting close to the end here. What else did I have? Outline. Okay, cool. Yeah, that's great timing. So back to the slides. So why, now that we have our own repo or our own profile on GitHub, our own accounts, we can create our own repos for our own personal accounts. Why create something for the lab that people like contribute to all together instead of separately? So one reason could be just a common space to store all of the code, especially code that's been used for publication. So maybe you want to work on your own code for your personal accounts until it's like ready and it's finished, and then you like add it as a repo to the lab so that everyone can find it at this one place. They don't need to look for your profile. If people are working on, let's say, the similar project together, there are different kind of project task boards that you can actually like track different, let's say, topics you want to address. So like maybe something's on like, it's basically a to-do list. So like something that has yet to be done, something that's in progress, something that's completed. And you can assign tasks to different people, including yourself. So like, even if like, let's say it's just your own project, you want to write out all these things, like I need to do X, Y, and Z, and you can like track your own progress. So that's one way to kind of keep yourself organized. Yeah, also makes it easy to collaborate and discuss things with people on GitHub regarding a certain project or repo. Commonplace, like a repository to store lab protocols, policies, data, etc. Just a bunch of different things all in one spot instead of, again, needing to check like 8 or 10 different like GitHub accounts. And one thing that also be done for whoever is the admin, one or more people, can set authorization levels for what people can do and what repos they can access. So maybe you want like 2 people to be able to like do things and access a repo, but you're okay if people see it otherwise from the lab. That's an option. Otherwise, they can be set to private if you'd like. So there's different ways to kind of set these authorization levels for different projects and different repos from a given organization. So kind of the call to action is set a organization up for the lab. So two examples of ones that I've come across that I think are really good examples are Mark Scheurel's lab at UW, and he does a lot of fishery science stuff, and Malin Pinsky's lab at Rutgers. So they'll have like info regarding kind of like lab rules, different guidelines regarding how meetings are conducted, sets of protocols for like field work versus lab work and different types of lab work, and then just common like repositories that people can look into. And then even I think for Malin Pinsky's lab, there's a section for like common problems and like ways to like deal with them for like R type of stuff, or GitHub, or maybe HPC stuff, so like high performance computing, like anything that like one person had a lot of trouble with and like can save somebody else a lot of time is like just writing it out and like adding it to the list of these things. So I've kind of made my own kind of personal Google Doc related to that type of thing, just so whenever I forget to do something later, I know how I can fix it. But yeah, so now that like everyone has an account, it's easy to basically connect it to a single GitHub organization. So yeah, don't necessarily need to do this on the spot because it's like 10:50, but this could be done by me or Mariana, and then you would just like invite people to join, and then from there people can like add things to it like repos or other
So
materials.
just to add to that, as you guys know, we're trying to figure out the best way to keep the lab knowledge and share it for future students. So obviously, this was the selective way to move forward. And one of the things that I want to do is to create, obviously, a lab in GitHub that we can all share. So I'm going to ask that for all publications from the lab that we have the scripts that are shared there, but also will also be a venue that we can share all the things that we have discussed, like not only for graduate students, but also for the undergrads. So this is a direction that we're moving forward, and that's why I'm so thankful that Josh runs us, so we can get our head around and, you know, move forward to have one place that we can find resources and not have to, you know, look through, because in the past we had Dropbox, and then we had Google Drive, and then we have, you know, like multiple things. So this will really make things easier as we move forward. It might be painful to start with, but I think it will make a huge difference in the near future. So I think, yeah, that's the direction that I want to take. So for the lab, you basically create an organization.
Yeah, so what that would look like is if I go to basically here is if I was to go to create a new repo, I can go to the bottom, it says new organization. And there are different options for plans. So if I was to, let's say, use like the free one, create free organization, the name, the contact email, and then who it belongs to, basically. And you would just kind of proceed from that.
Okay, and then you can invite people.
Yes.
So I guess maybe the first step is I can create one, and then maybe I can have you just admit
Yeah.
me.
Because I created one for the previous lab I was in, and it seems like nobody else has used it. But I have like all these repos of different projects I was working on, and you can set like different teams
Okay.
or is it projects? Yeah. So for there's one of these things that yeah, has like the description and then the to do in progress completed.
Okay.
So I started using it and then like stopped and started using like a physical version that I have like on a cork board now, basically. But yeah.
Yeah, one thing that I want to get my head around and I have to think a little bit about is the organization aspect of like the different components, right? Like, and once I have that visualized in my head or
Yeah.
written down, then we can start populating it differently. But I'll create one for the lab and invite people.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah, so for like people, there's like invite member, and then two-factor authorization, whatever role. So since I'm like the admin on this, I can just like change people's roles or convert to outside collaborators so they're no longer a part of the organization. Just different things like that. Yeah.
Does the GitHub account have a specified maximum storage? I noticed there was like on the free account, it's 500 megabytes. But does that apply to everything that you have in there? So you're limited to 500 megs?
I don't know off the top of my head. I've never had an issue with file sizes,
Yeah.
and some of the stuff I've contributed is like pretty large.
Mhm.
So I'll upload a bunch of remote sensing data. It's like all my NDVI from like multiple years, plus like other like indices from like Landsat or Sentinel, and I just push it. And as long as you don't do it all at once, where like, it gives you like, you can only push 100 megabytes of like a file size at once. Otherwise, it like tells you can't do that. But I've never had an issue where it says I ran out of storage space. So I've
That's
yet
one
to have
thing
an issue
we
with that.
run into like the Dropbox in the past or stuff like that, that it's the free account only gives you 2 gigabytes or
Yeah,
whatever. and
which
you're trying to
for
share with everyone, you quickly run out of that.
Students, I think, like when you set up an account, there's like an option to make it as a, I forget the name of it. There's like different tiers. It's like there's just like the standard one for like a free account, but then if you're like in education or something else, you have like other options, higher level options for like either more storage space or like more private repositories, just other things. So I forget what's involved in that, but I think that's at least possible for like students at bare minimum for free.